3 men in evening dress, 3 women treated as prizes, and 3 Gilded Age love triangles that ended in bullets, scandal, and the slow ruin of everyone involved. On a rooftop in 1906, the country's most famous architect was shot dead by a coal heir who had whipped his own wife for 2 weeks in a French castle. In a hansom cab in 1904, a national bookmaker died from a single bullet beside the chorus girl who had loved him. And in 1895, the largest divorce settlement in American history was about to weaponize a Vanderbilt. If you enjoy the dark history that the polite biographies left out, subscribe so the stories of the women at the center of these triangles keep finding you. Chapter 1. The Architect Who Bought a 16-year-old's Teeth. Before Stanford White was murdered on his own rooftop, he spent 1901 paying for a child's dental work and her mother's rent. He was 47 years old. She was 16, possibly only 15. Her name was Evelyn Florence Nesbit. She was a chorus girl in the musical Floradora at the Casino Theater, earning around $45 a week. He was the most famous architect in the United States. Stanford White had built the New York that the rich lived inside, the Washington Square Arch, the second Madison Square Garden, whose rooftop garden he had personally designed, the Villard houses on Madison Avenue, the Players Club on Gramercy Park, the Brooklyn Museum facade, mansions in Newport, houses on Fifth Avenue. He was a partner in the firm McKim, Mead, and White, a man with red hair and a thick mustache, and a habit of giving away money to women who caught his attention. His public life was uniformly admired. His private life was conducted on West 24th Street. There, he kept a studio. The studio had a mirrored bedroom and a famously kept red velvet swing suspended from the ceiling. The swing was 4 young women. He liked to push them on it. His friends knew. His business partners knew. His wife, Bessie Smith White, who lived quietly at their Long Island house, Box Hill on St. James, almost certainly knew. New York chose not to officially know. He was too valuable to expose. Evelyn Nesbit had arrived in New York from Tarentum, Pennsylvania, by way of Philadelphia. Her father, a small-town lawyer, had died when she was around 10. The family slid into something close to destitution. By 13, she was modeling for Philadelphia painters. By 15, she was modeling for Charles Dana Gibson, James Carroll Beckwith, and the photographer Rudolph Eickemeyer in New York. Her face was the most photographed in America. By 16, she was in the chorus line of Floradora. She supported her mother and her brother Howard out of her chorus girl wages. White first arranged to meet her through a chorus girl colleague named Edna Goodrich. He invited Evelyn and her mother to lunch at his studio. He served champagne and made the older woman feel grand. He paid for Evelyn's teeth to be capped. He moved the family from their boarding house to a flat at the Audubon Hotel. He paid the rent. He paid for Howard's tuition at Chester Military Academy. He paid for a country house called Beechwood near Tuxedo Park. Evelyn's mother trusted him. In her later testimony at Harry Thaw's trial, and in her 2 autobiographies, The Story of My Life in 1914 and Prodigal Days in 1934, Evelyn described what happened on a night when her mother was away in Pittsburgh. White invited her alone to the studio. He showed her the mirrored bedroom. He gave her a single glass of champagne. She woke in the bed, undressed and bleeding, with him beside her. She was 16. He told her never to tell. He told her that if she told her mother would no longer love her. He told her that he and she now had a secret. He continued to pay for everything. For about a year afterwards, she remained in his orbit. He took her to dinner. He showed her to his architect friends. He let her swing on the swing. He treated her in public the way a wealthy benefactor treats a young protege. In private, she later said, the secret never left the room. It is impossible to understand what came next without holding 2 facts at once. The first is that Stanford White was a celebrated public figure whom the city of New York adored. The second is that he had assaulted at least 1 girl who later named him, and almost certainly many more whom we will never know. He died with debts of around $500,000, equivalent to roughly $17 million in today's money, much of it spent on his appetites. After his death, his son Lawrence Grant White destroyed many of his private papers. We have what Evelyn Nesbit said in court, what the New York newspapers extracted from her, and the surviving photographs of a 16-year-old girl on a velvet swing. The rest is silence. That silence was the world Harry Kendall Thaw walked into in 1902, looking for a woman to save. Chapter 2. The Coal Heir Who Bought Her from the Architect. Harry Thaw inherited $3 million and a coal fortune, and the first thing he wanted with it was a woman another man had already ruined. He was 31 when he first saw Evelyn Nesbit dance. He was about to spend the next several years trying to acquire her. The Thaw family of Pittsburgh was old money in the strictest American sense. Harry's father, William Thaw the Elder, had built a fortune in coal, coke, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. He died in 1889, leaving an estate of around $40 million, equivalent to well over $1 billion in today's money. His widow, Mary Sibley Thaw, was a devout Presbyterian who controlled the bulk of the fortune through trusts and dispersed money to her son at her discretion. Harry's share of the estate was a yearly income of around $80,000 on top of an initial cash inheritance of $3 million. His sister Alice had married the Earl of Yarmouth. His sister Margaret had married into the Carnegie Circle. The family had bought every entry into society that money could secure. Harry himself had bought nothing useful with his portion. He had been discharged from Harvard for behavior his roommate described as drug use and threats. He had been thrown out of multiple New York clubs. He had been the subject of payoffs to chorus girls and prostitutes, whom he had whipped in private rooms. He carried a sword cane. He used cocaine and morphine. He had been arrested in Paris and London for outbursts that his mother had paid to make disappear. Polite New York knew him as a problem and avoided him. He saw Evelyn Nesbit for the first time some weeks after her 16th birthday. He sent flowers, he sent money, he sent a private box of chocolates filled with $1,000 in cash. She returned the cash. He kept sending. He had a private investigator follow her. He learned about Stanford White. He learned what White had done to her in the mirrored bedroom. He became obsessed. In the summer of 1903, he persuaded Evelyn and her mother to come to Europe with him. The two of them, mother and daughter, traveled at his expense through London and across to Paris. In Paris, he installed them in separate suites at a hotel. He behaved well enough for several weeks. He proposed marriage. Evelyn refused him. She had told him in confidence on the steamer crossing about Stanford White. He had become fixated. He spoke of nothing else. In a castle outside the Bavarian Alps called the Schloss Katzenstein, which Thaw had rented for the season, he separated Evelyn from her mother and locked her in a room. She testified later that he stripped her of her clothing and over a period of around 2 weeks beat her repeatedly with a dog whip. He demanded that she repeat the details of what Stanford White had done to her again and again while she stood naked against the door. He gave her laudanum. He fed her sparingly. He told her that he loved her and that he was teaching her morality. At the end of the 2 weeks, he asked her to marry him. She refused again. He kept her with him for the rest of the European trip. She had no money. She had no passport in her own name. Her mother had been told a different story and had returned to America. By the time Evelyn returned to New York in the autumn of 1903, she was 18 years old. She had been assaulted by two of the most powerful men in the country. Both of them now wanted to own her. Thaw continued to pursue her for another 18 months. He used the wealth of his mother. He used the threat of public exposure. He told Evelyn that if she did not marry him, he would tell the newspapers what Stanford White had done to her and ruin her in print before she could ruin White. He told her that, as Mrs. Harry Kendall Thaw, she would be protected. She did not believe most of what he said. She believed enough. In April 1905, after another beating in a New York hotel, she agreed. They were married on April 4th, 1905, in Pittsburgh, in a small ceremony at the Thaw family church. Harry's mother, Mary, did not attend. Neither did his sister Alice, the Countess of Yarmouth. The Thaw family considered Evelyn Nesbit, the chorus girl from Tarentum, beneath them. They believed that she had ruined Harry by marrying him. Evelyn Nesbit was 20 years old. She had agreed to a marriage she did not want, with a man she feared, in exchange for an allowance of around $2,000 a month, and the surname of a family that despised her. She had also, without knowing it, sealed Stanford White's death warrant. From the day of the wedding onward, Harry Thaw began to compile a dossier of what he called Stanford White's victims. He sent letters to magazines and to the moral reformer, Anthony Comstock. He hired detectives. He campaigned for a prosecution that he could not bring himself. By the spring of 1906, he had decided that the law would never punish Stanford White, and that he himself would have to. He began to carry a pistol in his coat pocket. Chapter 3. 3 Bullets on a Rooftop. In June. On the evening of June 25, 1906, Harry Thaw walked across the rooftop garden of Madison Square Garden, carrying a pistol in his coat pocket. He was 34 years old. He had been married to Evelyn Nesbit for 14 months. He had spent that year tracking the man he intended to kill. The rooftop garden was Stanford White's own design. He had built the second Madison Square Garden in 1890, with a Moorish tower modeled on the Giralda in Seville, an arena that seated more than 8,000, and a rooftop summer theater that hosted light musicals through the hot months. On that particular Monday night, the show was a slight new operetta called Mam'selle Champagne. The audience numbered around 900. Among them, sitting alone at a table near the stage, was Stanford White himself. White had spent the day in New York. He had taken his son, Lawrence, and his son's friend, Leroy King, to dinner at the Café Martin on 5th Avenue at 26th Street. The 2 younger men had then left him to go to another engagement. White had walked the few blocks to his own rooftop, ordered a drink, and settled in to watch the show. He was 52. He had a deep tan from his country summers at his Long Island estate, Box Hill. He was in financial trouble. He owed creditors close to $500,000. He did not yet know that he had less than an hour left to live. Harry Thaw arrived shortly after. He was with his wife Evelyn Nesbit and 2 acquaintances, Truxton Beale, a former diplomat, and Thomas McCaleb, a Pittsburgh friend. They had been at the Café Martin earlier in the evening. Evelyn had seen Stanford White there. She had pointed him out to Harry. Harry had said nothing. They had left the restaurant for a different show, found it dull, and decided to come to the rooftop instead. The fact that the man Harry Thaw had spent 3 years stalking would be at the rooftop in the building he himself had designed was the kind of accident that polite society called fate. The show ended around 10:45. Many of the audience were leaving. Stanford White remained at his table, slumped slightly, watching the last performers. Harry Thaw stood up from his own table. He walked across the floor toward Stanford White. He stopped about 3 feet behind him. He drew the pistol from his coat pocket. Witnesses later disagreed about what he said. Some heard him shout, "You have ruined my wife." Others heard, "You have ruined my life." The phrase was inscribed in newspapers across the country for the next 18 months and is still misquoted today. What every witness agreed on was that Harry Thaw fired 3 shots at point-blank range. The first bullet struck Stanford White in the left eye. The second and third struck him in the shoulder and the upper arm as he slumped forward. He was dead before his head hit the table. The audience screamed. Some thought it was part of the show. The manager rushed onto the stage to ask everyone to leave quietly. Harry Thaw walked toward the elevator, holding the pistol up in the air, the barrel pointed at the ceiling. He said, by various witness accounts, "He ruined my wife, or he deserved it." He surrendered the pistol to a fireman who happened to be on the scene. He was taken into custody by the police at the elevator door. He showed no emotion. He told the arresting officer that he had done it for the women of America. Evelyn Nesbit reached her husband on the stairs as he was being taken down. She kissed him. She told him she had not known. Witnesses heard him say, "It is all right, dearie. I have probably saved your life." They were the last words she heard him say as a free man. Stanford White's body was taken to a small private room. His son, Lawrence Grant White, was telephoned. Lawrence arrived around midnight and stood beside his father's body until the morning. He spent the next several decades destroying his father's correspondence, calendars, and the photographs taken in the mirrored room on West 24th Street. He buried the public man and the private man together. What survived of Stanford White after that night was what Evelyn Nesbit had to say about him at the witness stand, what other women told reporters off the record, and the buildings he had left behind. He had ruined the lives he had touched and built the city he had walked through. And the night of June 25, 1906, closed both books at the same time. Harry Thaw spent the night in the Tombs prison. His mother arrived from Pittsburgh within 48 hours. She engaged the most expensive criminal defense team in America, led by the San Francisco trial lawyer Delphine Michael Delmos. She would eventually spend approximately $1 million on her son's defense, equivalent to more than $30 million today. She was determined to save him. She believed that what he had done was justified. She would call the killing of Stanford White a public service. The country was about to spend the next 2 years arguing with her. Chapter 4. The bookmaker who tried to end the affair. Caesar Young had booked himself and his wife on the steamer Germanic for the morning of June 4th, 1904, and he never made the dock. His real name was Francis Thomas Young. He was around 40 years old, a national turf bookmaker who took bets on horse races across the eastern seaboard, and had built an estimated personal fortune of around $500,000, equivalent to roughly $17 million today. He had a wife named Margaret. He had no children. He had spent the last 2 years living a parallel life with a 21-year-old chorus girl named Nan Patterson. To understand what happened in the hansom cab on the morning of June 4th, 1904, you have to understand the world that Caesar Young moved through. The world of professional gambling in the 1890s and 1900s was a world of cash. The federal anti-gambling reforms that would shut down horse racing books in many states were not enacted until 1908. Until then, bookmakers like Young operated openly at racetracks from Saratoga in upstate New York to the courses in Maryland and Kentucky and out to the coast at Bay District in San Francisco. They carried thousands of dollars in cash. They lived in hotels. They moved with the seasons of the racing calendar. Young was widely known. The press called him by his nickname rather than his given name. He dressed expensively. He stayed at the best hotels. He traveled with his wife on the larger jobs and with Nan Patterson on the smaller ones. He had met Patterson around 1902, when she was 19 and dancing as an understudy in the original American touring company of Floradora. She had not made the original Floradora sextet, but the publicity of the sextet had attached itself to her by association. She was small, pretty, dark-haired, and very young. He fell by all accounts immediately. Nan Patterson had been born around 1882 in Washington, the daughter of a modest family. She had escaped Washington for the chorus line, as so many young women of her generation had. By the time she met Caesar Young, she had been on stage for 2 years. She had no other prospects. Young installed her in hotels under assumed names. He paid her bills. He took her with him on his racing circuit. They were seen together openly in Saratoga in the summers, in California in the winters, in London and Paris on his overseas trips. New York's racing world knew them as a couple. New York's polite society did not receive her at all. Margaret Young, his wife, knew. She had known for around 18 months. She had tolerated the arrangement in the way many wives of the era did, with silence and the threat of withdrawal. She loved her husband. She had married him before he had been wealthy. By the spring of 1904, she had decided that the arrangement could not continue. She gave him an ultimatum. He was to end the affair. He was to take her to Europe. He was to renew the marriage by, in effect, marrying her again. He agreed. He booked passage on the steamer Germanic for the morning of June 4th, 1904. He bought tickets to Paris. He told Nan Patterson the affair was over. She did not accept it. In her later courtroom testimony, and in the reporting of the case that ran on the front pages of every newspaper in the country, the picture that emerged was of a young woman who refused to believe that 2 years of money, attention, and travel could end in a steamer ticket bought for another woman. She believed Young loved her. She believed his wife had forced him. She believed if she could speak to him in private one more time, he would change his mind. The night of June 3rd, 1904, she found him. They went together to a series of lower Manhattan bars, drinking and arguing from around 10 in the evening until 4 in the morning. Witnesses later placed them at 3 separate establishments. They were seen at the Café Martin on 5th Avenue and then at smaller saloons in the Tribeca area, drinking, leaving, returning, arguing. By 4, they had separated. Young returned to his hotel near Madison Square. He had 2 hours to sleep before he had to meet his wife at the dock. He did not sleep. At around 7 the next morning, he was up. He dressed, he breakfasted, he gathered his papers, he carried approximately $8,000 in cash in his coat. He was due to meet Margaret at the dock at 9:15. He left the hotel a little after 8. Nan Patterson was waiting in the lobby. She had not slept either. She convinced him, in front of the hotel staff who later testified, to take a hansom cab downtown with her. She told him she needed 10 minutes to say goodbye properly. He agreed. He hailed a hansom cab from the street. The driver, a man named Frank Michaels, was a 47-year-old veteran of the New York streets. He helped Young and Patterson into the cab. He flicked his whip. The cab moved south down Broadway. Frank Michaels would be the only adult witness to what happened next. He would tell the same story for the rest of his life. Inside the cab, Young and Patterson talked. They argued. Their voices rose. They lowered. They rose again. The driver heard only fragments. The cab was at the corner of West Broadway and Franklin Street at approximately 9:15. He was about to make a turn. Then he heard a single shot. Chapter 5. A single shot. Inside a moving cab. The driver of the hansom cab heard a single shot at 9:15 on West Broadway and turned to find Caesar Young dying in the arms of his lover. Frank Michaels reined in the horse. He climbed down from his seat. He opened the door of the cab. Inside, he saw Nan Patterson cradling Young's slumped body. Young was bleeding from a wound to the chest. He was conscious for a few more seconds, and then he was not. He died in the cab before the police arrived. Michaels ran to the nearest patrolman. The patrolman ran to the cab. Within a quarter of an hour, the corner of West Broadway and Franklin Street was a small crime scene, and within an hour of that, Nan Patterson was at the station house, in shock, in a dress streaked with blood, telling the desk sergeant the story she would tell for the rest of her trials. Caesar had shot himself, she said. He had drawn the gun in despair at leaving her. She had tried to stop him. The gun had gone off. He had killed himself. The prosecution would argue otherwise. The argument turned on the physical evidence in the cab. The revolver, a small .32 caliber weapon, was found inside Caesar Young's own buttoned coat. The chest wound was at an angle consistent with the gun having been pressed against his body. The single bullet had passed through his lung. He had bled out in less than 2 minutes. The position of the gun and the angle of the wound were consistent both with suicide, if you accepted that he had drawn the pistol with his left hand while sitting beside her, and with murder, if you accepted that she had pressed the gun against his coat and pulled the trigger herself. Either story fit the body. Only the dying man knew which had happened, and he died without speaking. District Attorney William Travers Jerome of New York County was 45 years old in 1904. He had built his reputation prosecuting Tammany Hall corruption. He believed in the case. He believed that no rational man who had just booked passage to Europe with his wife would shoot himself in a hansom cab on his way out of town. He believed that Nan Patterson, having lost the argument over the relationship, had ended it the only way left to her. He charged her with murder in the first degree. The press fell on the story. The Hearst papers and the Pulitzer papers competed for daily coverage. Photographs of Nan Patterson at 21, in her best black hat with feathers, in her courtroom dress with high collar, became the most printed images of 1904. The Floradora connection gave the story glamour. The dying gambler gave it tragedy. The closed cab gave it mystery. The country read about her every morning. What the country saw was a slight young woman who appeared composed, occasionally tearful, who answered the prosecution's questions in a steady voice. Her family rallied around her. Her mother and her sister sat beside her every day of the proceedings. Her father told reporters that his daughter was innocent and was being persecuted because Caesar Young had been a wealthy man whose wife had powerful friends. The defense argued that the evidence was consistent with suicide and that the prosecution had not proved otherwise beyond a reasonable doubt. The first trial began on November 21st, 1904. It lasted nearly 3 weeks. The jurors heard from Frank Michaels, the cab driver, from the hotel staff who had seen Patterson in the lobby, from the bartenders at the Lower Manhattan saloons, from the medical examiner who had performed the autopsy, from the police officers who had taken Patterson into custody. They heard from Nan Patterson herself, who testified in her own defense and never broke from her story. The trial ended abruptly on December 14th, when one of the jurors suffered a stroke and no alternate was available. Judge John Davis declared a mistrial. The second trial began on December 8th, 1904. Jerome was determined. He brought new witnesses. He pressed Patterson harder on cross-examination. He demanded to know why a woman who had been left would willingly ride downtown with the man who had left her when his wife was waiting at the dock, unless she had planned something. Patterson held to her story. The trial ran through Christmas. On Christmas Eve, the jury announced it could not reach a verdict. The foreman, when pressed by the judge, said the jury had voted 10-2 for acquittal. The two holdouts could not be moved. Judge Davis declared a second mistrial. Jerome was undeterred. He tried her a third time, beginning in April 1905. By now, the country was tiring of the case. The newspapers had read the same evidence twice. The same witnesses repeated the same testimony. Patterson, by now 22, appeared visibly older, the strain showing in her face. Her counsel argued that the state was persecuting her past the point of any reasonable prosecution. The third trial ended on May 3, 1905, with another hung jury, declared by Judge Davis after the foreman reported that the panel was deadlocked and saw no path to resolution. District Attorney Jerome announced 4 days later that he would not pursue a fourth trial. He had charged her, prosecuted her, and lost 3 times. The evidence was what it was, the doubt was what it was. He let her go. The legal scholars of the period treated the Patterson case as an early test of the limits of prosecutorial doggedness. The principle that the state cannot try a defendant indefinitely on the same evidence, even where the prosecutor remains convinced of guilt, was strengthened by Jerome's decision to step back. The case has been studied for over a century by lawyers writing about reasonable doubt. The reason for that study was not Jerome's tenacity. It was the fact that 12 men in 3 different courtrooms had read the evidence and could not, between them, convict the woman who had certainly been in the cab when Caesar Young died. What none of those 3 courtrooms ever resolved was what had really happened. The cab driver heard 1 shot. The woman survived. The man did not. The system, after 8 months, 3 trials, and 1 stroke, gave up. Nan Patterson walked out of the New York Tombs prison on May 10, 1905, into a city that had been arguing about her for almost a year, and a crowd that had decided long before the third hung jury that she should never go back inside. Caesar Young's wife, Margaret, traveled to California with his body and buried him in the family plot. She inherited his estate, valued at around $600,000. She lived another decade and then died quietly in obscurity, the only woman in the triangle who had not been required to perform. Chapter 6. 3 trials. And a district attorney who gave up. William Travers. Jerome tried Nan Patterson 3 times for murder and could not get a single jury to convict her. The crowd outside the New York Tombs prison on the morning of her release was estimated by reporters at around 20,000. Some accounts placed the number higher. The street outside the prison was filled from wall to wall. The mounted police were called in to clear a path for her carriage. She was driven uptown to her family's rooms at the Hotel Marlborough on Broadway. She was photographed at the window. She was photographed in the lobby. She was photographed at the door of her room. She did not speak to the press. Her family spoke for her. That night, the Hotel Marlborough received around 2,000 telegrams from across the country. Some congratulated her. Some asked her to perform. Some offered her business propositions. The vaudeville agents arrived within hours. One of them, the impresario Claw and Erlanger, offered her $1,500 a week to tour the variety circuit. She accepted. The tour was a curious thing. Nan Patterson was not a particularly talented performer. She had been a chorus girl. She had no act. The agents wrote one for her. She came onto the stage in a series of theaters in the Northeast and the Midwest, took a bow, recited a short defense of her innocence, sang 1 song with a small band behind her, and exited. The audiences came in their thousands. They came not to see her sing, but to see her stand on stage and be the woman they had read about for a year. The tour grossed substantial money. By some reports, she earned more than $30,000 in the summer of 1905, equivalent to about $1 million today. The novelty wore off by the autumn. She also made 1 short film, an early silent reel produced by an independent New York studio. The reel reportedly depicted scenes from her trial. No surviving print is known to exist. The reel was shown briefly in Nickelodeons and disappeared. By 1906, Nan Patterson was no longer a national name. The newspapers had moved on. New scandals had taken her place. She had married a man named Leonard Smith Lyle in 1905 or 1906, an Englishman she had met during her trials. The marriage did not last. She divorced him and married again. The second marriage also failed. By 1907, she had moved out of New York and into a quiet life in the Midwest. The trail of public reporting on her thins out. By 1910, she is missing from the press entirely. Different biographers place her death in different decades. Some accounts say she died around 1937 in Toledo, Ohio. Others say she lived into the 1950s. No definitive grave has been documented in the public records. The woman who had been the most photographed woman in America during her trials in 1904 and 1905 effectively chose to disappear, and the country, having spent her down, let her go. The Patterson trial mattered for reasons beyond the verdict, or the lack of one. It marked the first time that an American chorus girl had become a national subject through a murder trial. It was studied for half a century by trial lawyers and journalism schools. Its broader influence on the law was real but limited. The Mann Act of 1910, intended to criminalize the transport of women across state lines for what the act called immoral purposes, was drafted in part as a response to cases like Patterson's, where the affair between an older married man and a younger chorus girl had moved openly across the eastern seaboard. The reformers behind the act argued that women like Patterson were not principals in their own lives, but victims of the men who took them across state lines. The act, in practice, was used as much to prosecute interracial relationships and to harass black men, including the boxer Jack Johnson, as it was to protect chorus girls. The reformers had not quite seen Nan Patterson plain. What Patterson herself thought of all this, we do not know. She left no memoir. She gave no late-life interviews. The few photographs of her in middle age are unconfirmed. She lived out the second half of her life as the woman who had walked out of the tombs and into a life so quiet that historians cannot agree on the year she died. What we can say with certainty is that Caesar Young was dead. His wife Margaret had buried him. His estate had passed to his widow. His name was a footnote in the racing history books and a chapter in the New York crime histories. The man who had stood between two women had, in the end, made a choice. The choice had cost him his life within a few hours of the morning he was supposed to leave for Europe. And the woman who had been left in the cab walked away. She walked away into a quiet that lasted half a century. The triangle had destroyed the man. The woman the system had pursued through 3 trials had outlived the man, outlived the prosecutor, outlived the city's interest in her. The destruction the triangle wrought on her was different. It was the destruction of public visibility, of any hope of normal life in the New York she had known, of the years she would spend never quite being permitted to be a private person again. She paid the price the men in her life had created. She paid it for the rest of a long, quiet life that no one any longer wanted to read about. Caesar Young had wanted to end the affair. He had ended it the only way he ever would. Nan Patterson, the showgirl from Washington, slipped out of the New York Tombs prison and walked into a kind of survival that the era had not designed her for. By the time she vanished from the public record, the city that had spent itself on her was already turning to its next sensation. The triangle had taken the man. The woman it had also taken, but more slowly and so quietly that even her own death has no agreed date. The third triangle, the largest of the 3, was about to play out at a different altitude entirely. Chapter 7. The Vanderbilt Wife Who Refused to Forgive. Alva. Vanderbilt was 40 years old when she decided that her husband's affairs had cost him the right to her name. She had been Mrs. William Kissam Vanderbilt for 20 years. She had built a Fifth Avenue mansion, a Newport cottage, and a place in society that her husband's grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had never quite been allowed to occupy. She had spent her marriage building the Vanderbilts as a social force. Now she was preparing to dismantle the marriage and keep the social force for herself. To understand Alva, you have to understand what she had inherited and what she had not. She had been born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama in 1853, the daughter of a cotton merchant whose fortune was wiped out in the Civil War. Her family had moved to Paris when she was young. She had been educated in France. She had returned to New York with very little money and a clear vision of where she wanted to be. In 1875, at the age of 22, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, a grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt and a man whose family had more money than New York knew what to do with. The Vanderbilts at that point were not yet society. They had built the New York Central Railroad. They had piled up fortune on fortune. But Caroline Astor, the gatekeeper of the so-called 400, had refused to receive them. The Vanderbilts were too new. They had built their fortune in 1 generation. Caroline Astor would not place them on her calling list. Alva resolved to break this. In March 1883, 6 years after her marriage, she threw a fancy dress ball at her new Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, at a cost of $3 million. The ball was rumored to have cost around $250,000. The guest list ran to more than 1,200 people. The whole of New York society was invited, with one notable absence. Caroline Astor's daughter Carrie was rehearsing for the ball in another house with her friends. Alva let it be known that as Mrs. Astor herself had never called on her, the Vanderbilt house could not properly invite the Astor daughter. Caroline Astor, faced with the choice of breaking her daughter's heart or breaking her social rule, called on Alva. The Vanderbilts were inside the 400. In the years that followed, Alva accelerated. She commissioned the architect Richard Morris Hunt to build Marble House in Newport, completed in 1892 at a cost of around $11 million, the most expensive private home in America at the time. The interior alone reportedly cost $7 million. She filled the house with French furniture and gold. She held the Newport summer season there. She entertained the Belmonts, the Astors, the Whitneys, and the new American aristocracy. She had won the social war. What she had not won was her own marriage. William Kissam Vanderbilt was a chronic philanderer. He had kept mistresses in New York. He had kept them on his yachts. The largest of his yachts, the Alva, named for his wife, was the floating site of much of his unfaithfulness. By 1893, the New York papers had picked up reports of a Mediterranean cruise on which William had been seen with the singer Nellie Nostretter. Alva, by then 40 years old, had grown to despise him. She had also fallen in love with someone else. That someone else was Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. Oliver was the second son of August Belmont, the New York representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty. He had inherited around $10 million at his father's death in 1890. He had been one of William Kissam Vanderbilt's closest friends. He had been a groomsman at William's wedding to Alva in 1875. He had cruised with William on the Alva yacht. He had, on a Mediterranean cruise around 1889, fallen for Alva himself. By the early 1890s, they were in love. By 1894, they were openly seen together at Oliver's Long Island estate, Brookholt. The Newport summer of 1894 was the first season in which Alva chose not to appear publicly with William at all. She had decided. She would not be a wronged wife in private and a Vanderbilt in public. She would be neither. She would file for divorce, take half of the largest American fortune outside of the Astors and Rockefellers, and remake her life with the man she preferred. Her sisters in New York society told her she would be ruined. They told her that no woman who divorced was ever received again. She told them, in her later memoir, Memoirs of Alva Belmont, that she did not care. She also did not care about the rules of the marriage market for her own daughter. She had already decided in 1894 that Consuelo, her 16-year-old eldest daughter, would marry the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The Duke had inherited a debt-ridden Blenheim palace and needed a wealthy wife. The Vanderbilts had money to spare. Alva, in the fevered weeks of 1904 and the early winter of 1895, was preparing two campaigns at once. She was preparing her own divorce, and she was preparing to sell her daughter to a duke. The two campaigns would converge in the courtroom and the chapel inside 7 months. Chapter 8. The Divorce That Cost $12 million. On the morning of March 6, 1895, Alva Vanderbilt walked into a Long Island courthouse and ended the largest American marriage of the era. The action was filed in Mineola in Nassau County, Long Island. Alva had chosen the venue deliberately. New York County would have meant the New York papers and an open courtroom. Mineola was quiet. The proceedings were closed. The press was excluded. She filed on grounds of William's infidelity. She did not mention her own relationship with Oliver Belmont, who at that point was still legally a bachelor and therefore a free agent. The legal mechanism was strict. New York and New York adjacent jurisdictions like Nassau County recognized adultery as the principal ground for divorce. To gain the freedom she wanted, Alva needed to document William's affairs. Her lawyers had been gathering evidence for nearly a year. They had hired private detectives. They had tracked the yacht. They had gathered statements. They had compiled what one lawyer of the era called the cleanest divorce file ever assembled in New York. The settlement was unprecedented. Sources of the period place the total at around $10 million in cash, plus marble house in Newport, plus an annual maintenance of around $100,000, plus custody of the 3 Vanderbilt children. The combined value of the settlement, when you include the Newport property and the present-day value of the annuity, comes to roughly $12 million in 1895 money, or close to $400 million in today's money. It was the largest divorce settlement in American history to that date by an order of magnitude. It set the bar against which every subsequent Gilded Age divorce was measured. William Kissam Vanderbilt agreed to it almost without protest. He had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming. His wife had outmaneuvered him. He had not expected her to file. He had assumed, as so many men of his class assumed, that she would continue to live alongside him in public, take his name and his houses and his fortune, and accept the parallel life of his yachts and his mistresses. She had refused. Once the divorce was granted, Alva moved with extraordinary speed. The decree was finalized in March 1895. By April, she had announced Consuelo's engagement to the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo had been in love, at 16, with a young American named Winthrop Rutherford. Alva had locked her in her room at Marble House until she agreed to the Marlborough match. Consuelo would later write, in her 1952 memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, that her mother had told her she would cut off all financial support, all family ties, and all communication if Consuelo did not marry the Duke. Consuelo, at 16, gave in. She agreed. The wedding was set for November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue. The dowry was set at $2,500,000 in cash, equivalent to roughly $80 million today, plus $100,000 annually from Vanderbilt Railroad stock for life. The Duke's family received the cash on the morning of the wedding in a transfer that was witnessed and signed in front of both legal teams. Consuelo cried throughout the wedding ceremony. Her veil hid her face. Her white satin gown trailed behind her down the aisle. Outside the church, the crowd numbered around 20,000. Alva had achieved 2 things in 7 months. She had divorced a Vanderbilt and kept the title of one of America's wealthiest women. She had married a Vanderbilt heiress to a duke and put the Vanderbilt name into Burke's peerage. She had also, almost incidentally, demonstrated to the women of New York society that a divorce could be survived if you handled the public reckoning correctly. The reckoning came next. In January 1896, 10 months after her divorce, Alva married Oliver Belmont. The ceremony was small. It was held at her townhouse on 72nd Street in Manhattan. The mayor of New York City performed the ceremony. There were no Vanderbilts present. There were also very few Belmonts. Oliver's brother, Perry, attended. The rest of the family stayed away. The marriage was the social bombshell that the divorce had merely been the prelude to. Alva had married her ex-husband's best friend, the man who had been a groomsman at her original wedding, the man whose yacht had carried her on the Mediterranean cruises that had eroded her marriage. She had done it openly. She had done it with the same speed and the same disregard for what was supposed to happen that she had brought to every campaign of her life. She had effectively told New York society that she would not pretend. New York society, in the end, accepted her. There were some who never received her again. Caroline Astor was rumored to have stopped sending the calling card. Some of the older Knickerbocker families closed the door. But the Vanderbilts as a clan needed Alva. She controlled Consuelo's marriage to the Duke. She controlled Marble House. She controlled the family's social calendar in Newport. The cousins and the in-laws found a way to live with the arrangement. She moved with Oliver to Brookholt on Long Island and to Belcourt in Newport, the Belmont mansion that Oliver had built for himself. Brookholt was a working farm with stables for Oliver's horses. Belcourt was an architectural curiosity, designed by Richard Morris Hunt at Oliver's request to house Oliver's horses on the ground floor and Oliver on the floor above. Alva moved in and remade the house. She had finally married a man who suited her, and she had taken the wealth of 2 of the largest fortunes in America with her. She and Oliver had 12 years together. They were, by every account, happy. He traveled with her. He was loyal to her. He was politically active and shared her impatience with the closed circles of New York society. He served briefly as a United States congressman. He died on June 10, 1908, after emergency surgery for appendicitis. He was 50. Alva was widowed. She was 55. The man she had reorganized her life to marry was gone in less than a fortnight. She did not remarry. She did not return to New York society in the way she had once dominated it. She turned instead to the cause that would define the rest of her life. Chapter 9. The Friend Who Took His Wife and Then Died. Oliver Belmont had been a groomsman at William Vanderbilt's wedding to Alva in 1875, and 21 years later, he was standing in his place. He had inherited around $10 million from his father, August Belmont, in 1890. He had spent it on Belcourt, on his horses, on his yacht, on his politics, and on Alva. He had married Alva on January 11, 1896. He had spent the next 12 and a half years with her. And then, in June 1908, he was dead. His death was sudden. He had developed acute appendicitis at Brookholt. He had been taken to a hospital in Hempstead. The surgeons had operated. The operation had failed. He had developed peritonitis. He had died on June 10th, 10 days short of his 50th birthday. He left an estate of around $8 million. Alva inherited the bulk of it. She buried him at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx in a mausoleum that she had commissioned. She returned to Brookholt for the summer. By the autumn, she was in New York. She was alone. She had no husband. Her children were grown. Consuelo was in England, slowly separating from the Duke of Marlborough in what would become her own scandal. Alva's son, Willie K. Vanderbilt Jr., was running the family's racing stables. Her son Harold was beginning his career as a businessman and yachtsman. In December 1908, she began to attend meetings of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She had been peripherally interested in the cause for years. She had not been an active participant. After Oliver's death, she committed herself entirely. She wrote a check for $100,000 to the association in 1909, equivalent to around $3.5 million today. It was the largest single donation the association had ever received from any private source. For the next 24 years, she ran her own campaign. She funded the New York suffrage parades. She rented offices for the movement. She paid the rent on the headquarters at 25 East 41st Street. When the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage broke from the larger association in 1913 and reorganized as the more militant National Woman's Party in 1916, Alva funded that as well. She paid for the construction of the National Woman's Party headquarters in Washington, which was renamed Alva Belmont House in her honor. She funded the picketing of the White House in 1917. She paid the bail of suffragists who were arrested. She wrote that what she had built with the Vanderbilt and Belmont fortunes was a movement, not a society house. In 1921, she was elected president of the National Woman's Party. She held the position until her death. She was fluent in French. She lived part of the year in Paris at her chateau on the Avenue Foch, and she split the rest of her time between New York and Newport. She remained until the end a woman who saw the world as a campaign to be won. She died on January 26, 1933. She was 80. She had outlived William Kissam Vanderbilt by 13 years. She had outlived Oliver Belmont by 25 years. She had outlived Caroline Astor by 25 years. She was buried at Woodlawn beside Oliver in the mausoleum she had commissioned for him. The Vanderbilt triangle had ended in ways that none of the original players would have predicted. William, the man who had been cuckolded, lived another quarter century. He remarried in 1903 to Anne Harriman Sands Rutherford, a woman who better suited his temperament and who tolerated his lifestyle. He died in 1920, leaving an estate of around $54 million, somewhat smaller than what he had inherited. He had spent and lost during the years after Alva left him. Oliver, the man who had won the wife, was dead in his 50s. Alva, the wife who had been the prize, outlived them both and used their combined fortunes to fund a movement that did more to reshape American women's lives than any social ball she had ever thrown. The triangle had not destroyed Alva. It had armed her. The settlement money had made her independent. The Belmont inheritance had doubled her resources. The freedom she had taken in 1895 had given her the practice for the freedom she would take with her widowhood in 1908. She had used her 30s to escape one marriage, her 40s to live inside the marriage she had wanted, her 50s and 60s to use the resources both marriages had supplied, and her 70s to lead a national political party. The men in the Vanderbilt triangle had played the game by the rules they had been taught. William had assumed his wife would tolerate his affairs. Oliver had assumed he could simply step into William's place. Both assumptions had been correct in a narrow sense. William's wife had not stayed. Oliver had stepped in. But the larger assumption that the wife was the supporting actor in the men's lives was wrong from the moment Alva chose to file. She had been the principal all along. The men had been her supporting cast. They had not known it. By the time they did, William had been divorced, Oliver had been dead, and Alva had buried them both and gone on to fund the suffrage movement of an entire country. The third triangle is the only one of the three that produced what looks like a winner. Even so, the cost was real. The years of social warfare, the forced marriage of her daughter, the exhausting work of remaking herself 3 times. The price was high. Alva had simply been better at paying it than anyone of her era. The other 2 women in this story, Evelyn Nesbit and Nan Patterson, paid a different price entirely. Chapter 10. The Witness Who Outlived Everyone Who Owned Her. By the time Evelyn Nesbit died in Santa Monica at the age of 82, both men who had fought over her had been dead for decades. She had outlived Stanford White by 61 years. She had outlived Harry Thaw by 20. She had outlived the New York that had read her testimony, the country that had read her photographs, and the era that had produced her. She died on January 17, 1967, in a small apartment in California of a heart attack. She was teaching ceramics at the time. She had been doing so for nearly a decade. The years after the trials had been hard. The Thaw family had promised her $1 million in exchange for her testimony in 1907. After the verdict, they reneged. She received around $25,000 in cash and a series of smaller payments that totaled no more than a fraction of the original promise. Her marriage to Harry was annulled by the Thaw family in 1915. The same year Harry was declared sane and released from the asylum. Her son, Russell Thaw, born in 1910, was disowned by Harry. Harry insisted against the dates and the medical evidence that the boy was not his. She turned to vaudeville. She had a passable singing voice and an undeniable presence on stage. She toured between 1908 and 1916 at varying salaries that diminished as the years passed. She made several silent films in the 1910s, including one called Threads of Destiny in 1914, a fictionalized account of her own life. The films did poorly. She opened a tea room in Midtown Manhattan in the 1920s. It failed. In 1926, she attempted suicide by drinking poison in a Chicago hotel. She survived. In the early 1930s, she attempted suicide again, this time by gas in another hotel. She survived again. She became dependent on morphine, having first encountered it during her European trip with Thaw in 1903. The addiction lasted decades. She published her second autobiography, Prodigal Days, in 1934. The book sold poorly. The country had moved past her. She wrote with surprising clarity about what had been done to her, about the men who had owned her, and about the years of her recovery. She did not blame Stanford White or Harry Thaw with the heat that one might expect. She wrote about both of them with a kind of weary precision, as if she had spent so long being asked to repeat the story that the heat had gone out of it. She moved to California in the late 1930s. She lived in small apartments. She taught painting and ceramics. She gave occasional interviews to magazine writers and to early television. In her last years, she was visited by the writers and journalists working on what would become the 1975 novel Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, in which she appears as one of the principal characters. She did not live to see the novel published. She did not live to see the 1981 film adaptation, in which she was played by Elizabeth McGovern. She did not live to see the 1998 musical Ragtime, in which she sings of having been the most photographed woman in America. She had been that woman. She had also been, for almost 70 years before her death, the most discarded. The men who had fought over her had not survived the fight in any meaningful sense. Stanford White had been shot dead at 52. Harry Thaw had spent 8 years of his life in an asylum, escaped, been retried, been released, and then immediately whipped a 19-year-old boy named Frederick Gump in Kansas City in 1917, and been recommitted until 1924. He had drifted through Florida and Long Island in his later years on what remained of his inheritance, a diminished, hated, and largely forgotten figure. He had died in 1947 of a heart attack at the age of 76. The Thaw fortune had been mostly consumed by his trials, his asylum bills, and his settlements with women he had injured. His mother, Mary Sibley Thaw, who had spent more than $1 million defending him in 1907, had died in 1929, never publicly admitting that her son had been guilty. Evelyn Nesbit had survived all of them. She had survived without their wealth. She had survived without her own. She had survived because the system that had broken her had also failed to entirely destroy her, and because she had refused to let it. She had lived through the assault by Stanford White at 16. She had lived through the abduction by Harry Thaw at 18. She had lived through the trials of 1907 and 1908. She had lived through the addiction, the suicides, the failed marriages, the lost son. She had lived to teach ceramics in a California afternoon. She left behind one son, Russell William Thaw, who lived a quiet life and died in 1991. She left behind a single autobiography that her readers in California had loved. She left behind a quiet grave. The mansion White had built her family was long demolished. The rooftop he had died on was long demolished. The Madison Square Garden where it had happened was the second of 4 buildings to bear that name. The era that had killed Stanford White and ruined Harry Thaw had also tried to ruin her. It had not succeeded. She was the witness. She had survived to tell the story. And the story she had told, on the witness stand in 1907 and in 2 autobiographies across 30 years, had outlived the men who had tried to write it for her. Chapter 11. The Showgirl Who Disappeared into Her Own Survival. Nan Patterson walked out of the Tombs prison a national celebrity and into a life so quiet that historians cannot agree on the year she died. The vaudeville tour of 1905 was her last visible public act. She left the stage by the end of that year. She had married Leonard Smith Lyle around the time of her release. The marriage was brief. She divorced him. She married a second man, a property developer, whose name appears in some accounts as William Smith. That marriage also failed. By 1907, she had left New York entirely. She went west. Some accounts have her in Chicago in 1908. Others have her in Ohio by 1910. Her family receded from the press at the same speed she did. Her father, who had been her loudest defender during the trials, gave a single interview in 1906 and was not heard from again in the public record. Her sister married and moved to Connecticut. Her mother, ill, died around 1912. The Patterson family, having stood beside Nan in 3 trials, dispersed into the same quiet she had chosen. By 1915, Nan Patterson is essentially a missing person to the press. The reporters who had once camped outside the Tombs prison in their hundreds had moved on. The Hearst papers had new chorus girls and new murders. The Pulitzer papers had a war in Europe. The country had lost interest. Nan Patterson was free to be invisible at last. The biographers who have tried to track her have not agreed. The most detailed work on the case is Carrie Seagrave's volume, Death in a Hansom Cab, published in 2020, which compiles the available archival sources. Even Seagrave cannot pin down the exact date or place of her death. Some accounts place her death in 1937 in Toledo, Ohio, of a heart condition. Other accounts have her living into the late 1940s or the early 1950s. There is no agreed grave. There is no agreed obituary in a national paper. What does this disappearance mean? It means, in part, that Nan Patterson got something that very few women of her era got, which was the chance to be private. She had been the most public 21-year-old in America in 1904 and 1905. She had been photographed daily. She had been read about over breakfast. Then, in her early 20s, the country let go. The country did not let go because it had forgiven her, or because it had decided she was innocent, or because it had absorbed her back into its narrative of decent womanhood. The country let go because it had taken what it wanted and moved on. The cab ride, the trial, the verdict, the release, the vaudeville tour, the Christmas Eve hung jury. All of it had been the entertainment of a season. The season had ended. The privacy Patterson got was not a privacy of dignity. It was a privacy of erasure. She did not move into a quiet marriage with a kind man. She did not retire to a comfortable widow's house. She married twice and divorced twice. She drifted between cities. She lost touch with what remained of her family. She left no diary. She left no portrait of herself in middle age. She gave no late-life interview. The few unconfirmed photographs of her in the 1920s show a woman who could have been any worn-out clerk in any small American city. She had survived in the same way that many women survived the systems that consume them. She had survived by becoming small. She had ducked under the wave of public attention by making herself unworthy of further reporting. The country had been told for almost a year that she was the most fascinating woman in America. By 1906, the country had been told that she was no longer interesting. She had taken that verdict and used it. She had become so uninteresting that no one ever looked for her again. The Caesar Young estate had gone to Margaret Young in California. Margaret had lived another 10 years. The Young name had disappeared from the racing pages within a few years of his death, partly because the federal anti-gambling reforms of 1908 had closed the Eastern racing books. The world that had produced Caesar Young, the world in which a national bookmaker could keep a wife in California and a chorus girl in New York and travel between them with thousands of dollars in cash, was gone within a decade of his murder. The hansom cab was gone within 15 years. The horse-drawn cab of the 1890s had been replaced by the gasoline taxi cab by 1916. The corner of West Broadway and Franklin Street looked unrecognizable by 1920. The single shot fired inside the closed cab in June 1904 had killed Caesar Young, indicted Nan Patterson, occupied 3 trials, and then vanished into the same disappearing world that had produced it. The triangle had destroyed the man, almost certainly. It had also destroyed something in the woman, but more slowly and more privately. Nan Patterson survived. She survived in a way that the era could not see, which was a survival in invisibility. Her last 50 or 60 years of life left almost no public trace. That, in its own way, may have been her victory. The system that had wanted to display her had been forced, finally, to let her vanish. What she made of her disappearance only she knew. She kept it. She gave it to no one. And so, in a story full of dead men and living women, Nan Patterson exits the page on her own terms, which were the terms of a woman who had decided that being unseen was the only privacy left to her. Chapter 12. The women who watched the men destroy each other. 3 triangles, 3 dead or ruined men, and 3 women who lived long enough to understand exactly what had happened to them. Stanford White was shot dead at 52 on a rooftop he had designed. Harry Thaw spent 20 years of his life in asylums and died at 76, largely forgotten. Caesar Young died at 40 in a moving cab. William Kissam Vanderbilt lost his marriage and a substantial portion of his inherited fortune. Oliver Belmont died at 50 of a routine surgical complication. 6 men. 5 untimely ends. 1 outlived the others into bored obscurity. The women lived. Evelyn Nesbit reached 82. Alva Vanderbilt. Belmont reached 80. Nan Patterson reached at least her 50s and possibly her 70s. Margaret Young, the wronged wife in the Patterson Triangle, lived into the 1910s. The 3 central women in these triangles, the women society had spent the 1890s and the 1900s and the 1920s calling tragic, scandalous, ruinous, and dangerous, all outlived the men who had insisted on their importance. They all watched the era that had owned them give way to a different era they had been told they would never see. This is the deeper truth that the Gilded Age never publicly accepted. The men in these stories believed themselves to be the principals. They believed the women were prizes, accessories, supporting characters in their own grand drama. Stanford White assumed he could ruin a 16-year-old girl and continue building churches. Harry Thaw assumed that murdering Stanford White would restore Evelyn Nesbit to him, like the title deed to a piece of property. Caesar Young assumed that he could end a 2-year affair with a steamer ticket. William Kissam Vanderbilt assumed his wife would forever tolerate his yacht and his mistresses. Oliver Belmont assumed he could step into William's place and own what William had merely held. In every case, the men were wrong. Stanford White is remembered today not for his buildings, but for what Evelyn Nesbit said about him in court. Harry Thaw is remembered only as the man who killed Stanford White. Caesar Young is a footnote in the histories of horse racing and the histories of New York crime. William Kissam Vanderbilt is a footnote in the Vanderbilt family tree. Oliver Belmont is a name on a mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. The women are the names that survived. Evelyn Nesbit is the witness of Dr. Rowe's ragtime, of 2 autobiographies, of the long shadow of the most famous murder trial of the Progressive era. Nan Patterson is the woman whose 3 hung juries are still studied by lawyers. Alva Vanderbilt is the suffragist whose money built the National Woman's Party. But it would be too neat to leave the story there. The women survived, in fact. They did not survive in the same way that men survive. The system that the Gilded Age had built around them did not break when the triangles broke. It went on punishing them. Evelyn Nesbit spent 50 years recovering from what 2 men had done to her at 16 and 17. She spent decades in vaudeville and silent film and addiction and suicide attempts. The fortune that should have been hers under the Thaw family's promise was never paid. She survived. She survived poor. Nan Patterson spent her survival in invisibility. She had been told she was a celebrity. She had been told she was a murderess. She had been told she was an innocent. When the country was finished with her, she was let go into a quiet so total that we do not know the year she died. Alva Vanderbilt is the one woman who survived in the way that men might recognize. She survived rich, she survived public, she survived powerful. But her survival had been bought with her daughter Consuelo, sold to the Duke of Marlborough at 16 against her will. It had been bought with the social warfare of 2 decades, with the construction of mansions she did not really need, with the forced reorganization of 3 lives at once. Alva won the game. The game still cost her something. The game cost her daughter much more. What does this story leave the viewer with? It leaves the viewer with a question. We tell the history of the Gilded Age as a history of men. The robber barons, the railroad kings, the architects, the bankers, the bookmakers. We name their fortunes. We tour their mansions. We read their biographies. The women appear in those stories as the wives and the mistresses and the daughters, the supporting characters in the men's lives. These 3 triangles ask us to look at the same history from the other side. From the side of the woman in the chorus line, the woman in the cab, the woman in the courtroom. The same fortunes look different from there. The same buildings look different. The same names look different. The men we have called great look smaller, more frightened, more cruel. The women we have called scandalous look braver, more durable, more clear-sighted. The men made the choices. The men killed each other or destroyed themselves. The women paid the price. They paid the price every day of the long lives they lived afterwards, and they paid it without much help and without much acknowledgement. The question the documentary leaves you with is whether we have ever, in the more than 100 years since, learned to see those women plainly, or whether we are still, every time we read about Stanford White, or Harry Thaw, or the Great Vanderbilt divorce, or the Floradora chorus girl in the hansom cab, doing what the era did, which is to look at the men and let the women stand silently behind them. The triangles destroyed the men. The women are still here. They are still asking us to look. If a story like this is the kind you want to keep finding, hit subscribe so the next one reaches you. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from, and which of these 3 triangles you think the era treated most unjustly: Evelyn Nesbit's, Nan Patterson's, or Alva Vanderbilt's, and why. Your answers are what keep this channel running.